Alright, so if you guys clicked on this video, you saw how long it was. And I'm saying that before even recording or editing any of it, so it's probably going to be longer than I even think. So all I'd ask is that you just consider what I'm saying. Even if you don't watch all the way through, I ask that you actually listen to the sources I'm providing, and also tell me if I'm wrong, and I'll try to do the same. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So, one argument for the resurrection I constantly hear is that the disciples were clearly willing to suffer and even were martyred for their faith, therefore they must be telling the truth, and somehow, by extension, it follows that Christianity must also be true. And this assertion has obviously some simple logical fallacies and definitional problems, but also the evidence and arguments are far more complex than these apologists or laypeople make them seem. So, first let's address the immediate problem with this argument. The famous counterexample that people always bring up is the Islamic terrorists that also died for something they claimed or thought to be true. Does that make their religion true? No, and that's the answer literally everyone else gives, no matter what side of the argument they're on, as long as they are at least fairly knowledgeable in this issue. And neither does this argument for Christianity. It's not meant to do that. It's simply meant to demonstrate that we can suspect their sincerity in their faith or religious practices. So think of it this way: we can break down the possibilities into three categories surrounding the resurrection. So number one would be, and I'm not saying this is correct, but number one is the 12 were both sincere and correct in their faith, and therefore the Christianity movement that sprang out of that was true. Number two would be the 12 were sincere and incorrect in their faith, so although they thought it to be true, it's not actually. And then number three is they're both insincere and also therefore technically incorrect in their faith, but they never really believed it in the first place. And this would mean that they were lying or there was some sort of conspiracy. They believed it not to be true and they were doing it for some other reason. And this argument is just simply attempting to remove possibility 3 by demonstrating that the original 12, or potentially a select few of them, were willing to undergo serious physical punishments for their faith. And also, before we get into looking at the actual sources, this video will briefly address the evidence for each of their disciples' individual martyrdoms first, but then, without an extensive look at the context and contemporary sources, these evidences will mean very little, so that's why I'm going to back them up as it follows. Now, as you probably know, if you have some or any background knowledge on this topic, evangelical apologist Sean McDowell did his doctoral dissertation on this and eventually wrote a book on it, and arguing that of all of the original 12, we can have the highest degree of confidence for the martyrdom of 4 specific apostles. We got Paul, Simon Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and James the brother of Jesus, or James the Greater. So in the last few years, he has decreased his confidence in James the son of Zebedee as the only reliable historical reference we have to his death, let alone martyrdom, is found in Acts 12:2, where he's supposedly put to death by the sword by Herod Agrippa, who's a bit of tangential here, but incidentally, he's the grandson of Herod the Great, who's a central figure in the birth narratives, or at least one version of them. That's a whole other video, though. It's overall uncontroversial that the book of Acts portrays lots of suffering and Christian persecution, and definitely James's death. The only problem is the book's reliability, which I have my own reasons for believing that it can't really be trusted as a historical source. But that depends on your view of that, so for this reason, I'm not going to address his martyrdom directly here. The second main disciple that can be briefly addressed is James, the brother of Jesus. So, the earliest source that we have on his martyrdom is Josephus, talking about how he was stoned to death around 62 CE. Not how his stoning was 62 CE, but Josephus's account was then. And Josephus wrote, because Ananus was of this persuasion, he considered he had a fitting opportunity, since Festus, and this is the guy that got Pontius Pilate's old job, if you know who that is, had died, and Albinus was still on his way. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and bringing before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name is James, and certain others, he made an accusation against them as breakers of the law, and delivered them over to be stoned. Basically, if we take this to be a reliable account, we know that James had some kind of personal problem with this guy called Ananus. However, as we will still see to be a theme as we continue to go on, it is uncertain whether this is an ideological or political death, and without a further look at the evidence, it will be impossible to tell. So now moving on to the apparently first of the best-backed disciples by Sean McDowell. So the earliest reference to the martyrdom of Peter is the last chapter of the Gospel of John. And in the New International Version, or NIV translation, John 21:18 reads, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." So if you actually look at the historical context and contemporary sources here surrounding this, the language of stretching out one's hands is consistent with being led to one's death, especially at a public execution. Though it should be said that deriving this conclusion from this specific verse is a matter of interpretation. It is, however, potentially supported by 2 Peter 1:12-15, which reads, "So I will always remind you of these things, even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth you now have. I think it is right to refresh your memory as long as I live in the tent of this body, because I know that I will soon put it aside, as our Lord Jesus Christ has made clear to me, and I will make every effort to see that after my departure you will always be able to remember these things." So while the authorship of both of these texts is disputed, very much so, both these examples, regardless of the authorship, they're still both examples of early Christian traditions that Peter was martyred. So these represent early Christian beliefs at the time, or at least a few decades after his supposed death, that he was in fact martyred, depending on your interpretation of these verses here. But regardless of the author of either book, there's still definitely relevant data points that show the early Christian beliefs at this time. So they're important to take into account. Jonathan McClatchy, on these verses, wrote, "If there were no such early persecution to speak of, it is unlikely that the evangelists would have attributed these words to Jesus, regardless of whether the historical Jesus actually uttered those sayings." That's speaking on the former verse when Jesus is supposed to have kind of prophesied Peter's death. Depending on how you read it. And assuming the above interpretation, these verses make it likely that there was some Christian persecution, right? This makes sense. The gospel authors wouldn't have put these words in Jesus' mouth that he's predicting Peter's death. Again, assume the interpretation that this means by public execution. They wouldn't have said that Jesus predicted Peter's death because of some form of persecution if there was no persecution. So this can act as a very pretty strong data point, signaling us towards some early anti-Christian movements or persecution against them. The obvious objection to what I've been saying is the caveat of consistently laid in my sentences, which is what some people like Rudolf Bultmann try to argue, that John 21:18 isn't talking about martyrdom. But the very next verse, John 21:19, explicitly says, "Now he had said this, indicating by what kind of death he would glorify God." So clearly, again, regardless of the authorship, this book is talking about martyrdom, or at least death. Definitely martyrdom, though, I think. Also, somewhat corroborated with John 13:16, Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later." And Richard Bauckham actually says that in the context of 21:18-19, it's clear that the following of Jesus, to which Peter is called in 21:19, will culminate in his martyrdom. This means that the author of 21:19 certainly understood 13:16 to be a prediction of Peter's martyrdom. Most commentators see 13:16 in this way. So basically all he's saying is that it's pretty obvious to us that 21:18-19 is talking about martyrdom. So that's also, we can think that John 13:16 will, because he's already made that claim later on. However, a popular anti-apologist, Chrissy Hansen, brings up the criticism that it might not entail martyrdom. He goes on to say that even if it was referring to martyrdom, why would it be the Romans? Firstly, his criticism doesn't address someone else will bring you where you will not want to go. So if he does acknowledge that it's talking about death, which I think it clearly is, if he's not being brought there of his own will or of his own accord, seems like it's not of his own will or of his own accord. That that's just the rule of identity. But also, stretching out your arms is commonly thought of as preceding execution, either by crucifixion or burning at the stake. It's true, we can't really tell between those just from that verse. But that doesn't really matter. If it is indeed a public execution, of course the Romans would be involved. Who else at this time would have the power to do so? Not the Jewish leaders. You notice, the Jewish leaders, depending on how you read, how far back in time you go, the Jewish leaders in the early Gospels had, little to no power over whether Jesus was killed. Obviously, again, another tangent here, but the further in time you go, actually, the more blame the authors put on the nation of Israel and the Jews there. That's a whole nother video, again. But basically, Chrissy Hansen's objection here doesn't really have any power or anything to support it. So now moving on to the second of McDowell's most attested to martyrs is Paul, and that has some pretty strong sources to support it. One of them is Paul's prediction of his own death in his own book, 2 Timothy 4:6-7. He writes, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith." And although the pastoral epistles are very likely forgeries, as Richard Carrier puts it, pretty much all non-fundamentalist experts agree the pastoral epistles are forgery. Their style, vocabulary, and theology differ substantially from the authentic 7 Pauline letters. Again, same thing as we looked at with Peter, it also shows another early Christian tradition of recognizing the Apostle Paul's martyrdom. So also another good representation of early Christian beliefs at this time. Chrissy Hansen, the anti-apologist I mentioned from earlier, I'm going to continue to address his objections to my arguments. He tries to undermine the significance of this passage in the early Christian tradition we can infer by actually granting Pauline authorship, which is very interesting. It's one of these weird paradoxes where granting Pauline authorship seems to actually help him.
The letter does not tell us his life will absolutely be ended, but only that Paul thinks it will, assuming generously he wrote the letter. But if we believe Christian tradition, such as in Acts 14, where Paul is stoned and nearly died, he had plenty of reasons to think he might be killed in various scenarios. So is this evidence of his final execution by the Romans? Does Paul say who his captors are, where he is held captive, what the circumstances of his captivity are? No. He says nothing except that he expresses hopelessness for his material life.
So if we actually grant that Paul wrote this letter, then that means he's only predicting his death. And as Chrissy Hansen would say, obviously then he's not talking about his martyrdom. But this then would become one of many, many data points that would show just persecution against Christians, which, yes, definitely has a lesser pull than martyrdom, but it's still a significant data point, attesting to the fact that Paul was undergoing severe physical punishment and persecution for his faith, which still leads us to believe that he was sincere. In an uncontested Pauline letter that we know he wrote, he does write about how he previously persecuted other Christians. In Galatians 1:13, he writes, "For you have heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it." Then he talks about how he himself was persecuted after converting and becoming Christian, after his road to Damascus moment. In 1 Corinthians 15-9, he writes, "For I am the least of the apostles, and not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." This is very significant in that it is a good reason to believe that the early Christians were discriminated against for their religious beliefs. If this is a reliable account of history, it is a very significant data point, and yet again, it seems like the author, Paul, wouldn't write about persecution of Christians if there was no persecution of Christians. So it seems to be a very strong data point towards that conclusion. Andrew Loke writes, "Such an admittance to being a persecutor and appeal to public knowledge of persecution are reasons to think that the early Christian references to persecution cannot be explained away as merely rhetorical motivated claims. Rather, these references have a basis in history." This is something I agree with. Some, like Canada Moss, object, saying that no real Christians existed. She writes that Paul himself would admit that he had participated in this practice lends credibility to the narrative of Acts, but it does not prove that Jews persecuted Christians. This primary reason for this is that there were no Christians. Not only did a name Christian not yet exist, but the idea of Christians as a group distinct from the rest of Judaism did not exist in the lifetime of the apostles. The followers of Jesus were, like Jesus himself, Jews. There was no question of their founding a separate sect. At the time when Paul was writing, like Peter, Andrew, James, and all of the original apostles, was a Jew. This is pure semantics, regardless of whether or not they're called Christian, whether they officially started a new sect of Judaism, was certainly persecuted and thought of as different than the rest of the Jews. Paul talks about in some of his letters. In Galatians 1:13, that we just read, he literally says, "How I used to persecute the church of God." And in Corinthians, the church of God is referenced again. Trent Horn, I think, said it pretty well.
This is just a bunch of semantic nonsense. Jews who follow Jesus, whether or not you call them Christians, were violently persecuted by Jews who did not follow Jesus. That's all we need to prove when it comes to demonstrating that the apostles willingly faced persecution for their belief in Jesus. Moss also has to downplay non-Christian sources to maintain her argument that Christ followers were not known as Christians until the end of the 1st century.
Though obviously appealing to only the Bible might make our claims a little less credible for various reasons, so we can do it without that. We can go through the early church fathers to show these traditions. The earliest and perhaps most significant of these early church fathers is Clement of Rome, and for our purposes, the relevant text is 1 Clement 5. He writes, "But not to dwell upon ancient examples, let us come to the most recent spiritual heroes. Let us take the noble examples furnished in our own generation. Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance, after being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee, and stoned. After preaching both in the East and West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the West, and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus he was removed from the world and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience." So it seems like Clement here, or the author's Clement, we'll get into that later, is just outright stating that both of them were martyred. But in the Greco-Roman world, bearing witness was a crucial aspect of legal proceedings, and martyreo could refer to either bearing witness, giving one's testimony, or what we usually think of as martyrdom in today's context, in that modern sense of the word. So we can't actually be sure whether he's referring to martyrdom in the way that we think about it, dying for one's beliefs, but he does outright state, and there's no weird translation stuff here, that they were killed and persecuted against, and he specifically that they were killed and persecuted against. This reference to the persecution, murder, and potential martyrdom of Peter and Paul is a significant piece of evidence. But also, according to Irenaeus, Clement was pretty close to the apostles and would be ideally positioned to know whether they were murdered or martyred. The Apostle Paul even references Clement by name in Philippians 4:3, so if this is written by Clement, we don't actually know that because it's only attributed to him. The author of this lengthy address kind of letter never actually identifies himself. We don't have any historical data or sources that point to him actually writing it, but we know that people said that he wrote it afterwards, which is very faint data point pointing towards that he did, but it doesn't really matter. If he did write it, though, Paul says in Philippians 4:3, "Indeed, true companion, I ask you also, help these women who have shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement, as well as the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life." If it is actually Clement, he would be in a very good position to know whether they were murdered or martyred. So this seems like a very reliable source in that, and this is a very significant reference from Clement or whoever wrote it as very early. This is just a very strong church tradition. We can think that it's being written around 96 to 98 AD, so right before the beginning of the 2nd century. This is definitely within the time frame of living memory. This is very contemporary here. Also, it's a stronger piece of evidence for their martyrdoms than you might think. The emphasis Paul places on the noble examples furnished in his own generation, Peter and Paul, shows the strength of this Christian idea that they were in fact martyred, because it seems like they're the foremost examples of being sacrificed for Christ, glorifying Jesus, that kind of thing. Now, one might argue that Clement doesn't explicitly say that the Romans were the people that killed Peter and Paul, but again, who else would have? These were the people that had authority to do so at the time, and we have no evidence or no real data pointing to anyone else, so we can infer that they were the ones that killed them. In fact, if you read on to Clement 6, Clement shifts to female martyrs, referencing Greek mythology to show that it was against their will, connecting these to Peter and Paul. He says, "To these men who spent their lives in the practice of holiness, there is to be added a great multitude of the elect, who, having through envy endured many indignities and tortures, furnished us with the most excellent example. Through envy, these women, the Danaids and Dirce, being persecuted after they suffered terrible and unspeakable torments, finished the course of their faith with steadfastness, and though weak in body, received a noble reward." So Danaids and Dirce are clear references to Greek mythology. In fact, these Greek women were given as prizes, kind of property, to the winners of a race, and Dirce is talking about one specific Greek woman that died in a very horrific manner. This makes this reference likely talking about the martyrdom of many Christian women around the time the author of Clement, at least after the deaths of Peter and Paul, is writing. Then by extension, the connection to the recent spiritual heroes of Peter and Paul means the author is referencing their treatment and likely martyrdom with the same end result, if not by the same means. Also, he notes that they both are glorifying God, which is another connection there. Now, Hansen, yet again, claims that Clement is better interpreted as attributing Peter and Paul's deaths from the Christian leaders. He says the Greek word, hegumenon, translated here as prefects, often refers to Christians. But if you actually look at it, this claim is just not correct. As Henry Tascher said, this was used to reference rulers regardless of their religion or relation to Christianity, more so their societal status and power. The author is using this hegumenon word here to reference the power officials in Rome that ultimately killed him. But Hansen kind of comes back and backs up his argument by saying that Clement is arguing later for Roman intervention, and that would seem to make his argument make sense. But this doesn't seem at all what Clement is talking about. Does the on-screen passage seem like a plea that they would step in, like that they haven't already been acting on this specific issue? Maybe if you take out without offense, but this seems much more like a request that they would use their power wisely than that they would begin to use it. I'll leave it to you to determine if this argument works. Another early church father we'd have to back this Christian tradition up is Ignatius of Antioch. In his epistle to the Cimmerians, he writes, "For I know that after his resurrection also he was still possessed of flesh, and I believe that he is so now. When, for instance, he came to those who were with Peter, he said to them, 'Lay hold, handle me, and see that I am not an incorporeal spirit.' And immediately they touched him and believed, being convinced both by his flesh and spirit. For this cause they also despised death, and were found its conquerors." So, as Sean McDowell writes, this phrase minimally suggests that they were unafraid of death. Found its conquerors, at the very least, seems to be talking about how this bravery, and not being afraid of it, was at least tested in some way later on. Richard Bauckham believes that the last phrase is actually referring to martyrdom. He talks about how this expression is standardly used at this time to refer to that, especially in the heroism of soldiers in battle, but also in Jewish and Christian literature was kind of used for the attitude of someone being, again, in our traditional sense, the word martyred. And Ignatius also can be a source for the martyrdom of Paul. He writes, "You are the persons through whom those pass that are cut off for the sake of God," and then he keeps going. Him using Paul as one of the foremost examples of being cut off for the sake of God shows that Paul was likely martyred. Again, the obvious objection is, Ignatius doesn't explicitly say he was killed by the Romans or died in Rome. But yet again, then who would publicly execute him? Another source would be Polycarp. It's widely held that Polycarp wrote this letter I'm about to read in the wake of Ignatius's martyrdom, likely in 108 AD, and this makes him quite an early witness and explains why he brings up Ignatius. Ignatius's death, he was martyred, being the catalyst for this letter means likely that all the others listed hold many of the same characteristics, namely, were also martyred. This makes sense with the last sentence, as he has said that they suffered with Christ. Technically, this doesn't explicitly say that he was martyred. One response is that it's not an implausible reading that suffered with Christ would mean that they suffered literally with Christ, or in the same manner as Christ. They were also crucified or executed. But putting this letter into the context of our other sources makes this verse very likely a reference to martyrdom and just backs up what we've already established. One final witness before I move on is Tertullian, who's writing at the beginning of the 3rd century. Now, notably, this is outside of the period of living memory established basically until the end of the 2nd century. And for that reason, a lot of people think it's too late to be meaningful. But though he is writing at the dawn of the 3rd century, remember he's born in mid-2nd century, so had access to some of those living memory sources. Granted, slippery slope argument, you could argue this kind of just defeats the purpose of the concept of living memory. However, he explicitly states that anyone who wants to fact-check him can simply do so by checking official Roman records. This is just a crazy credibility-providing piece of his writing. And yet another source that proves that Peter and Paul, and maybe potentially even James and Stephen, were killed and maybe martyred. Hansen objects, saying that Tertullian's account contradicts that of others like Irenaeus and the Acts of Peter, in the degree of descendancy they got their power from, and Peter's presence in Rome. This is just a misguided criticism. The law of non-contradiction is simply that two contradictory accounts or claims cannot both be correct in the same time and sense. So even if he is correct that they are contradictory, it wouldn't follow that they're then both wrong. He's also wrong about the contradictions. The relevant text from Tertullian is as followed: "Whom, as having been appointed to their episcopal places by the apostles, they regard as transmitters of the apostolic seed. Now, how much the meaning of the sentence depends on the word apostles. Hansen's contradiction claim depends entirely on this. Does apostles necessitate the original 12? No. Tertullian isn't providing a complete kind of genealogy of their authority, but he's just rather referencing that at some point it originally came from the apostles, hence apostolic seed. Thanks for watching. Like and sub if you want. I'll answer any comments and stay lucid.